Welcome, everyone. I am Dash Gierhart. My pronouns are he, him. I'm Dash Gierhart of Journey Punks, and today I am joined by a very special guest, the creator of Eberron himself, the amazing author, Keith Baker. Thank you so much for being here today, Keith. How are you?
I am doing okay. Thanks for having me, Dan.
Yeah.
And I am also he, him, just for the record.
All right. Yeah, that record's important. All right, for sure. Well, hey, Keith, for those who are not as familiar with you and your work, could you please give us an introduction of who you are and a background of your work in gaming, please?
Sure, certainly. I am Keith Baker. I've been working on professionally as a game designer for a little over 25 years. I am best known for creating the campaign setting of Eberron for Dungeons and Dragons and the card game Gloom. But I have also written for scads of other systems, and through my own company, Together Studios, over the last 6 years, I've made Phoenix Dawn Command. I've made the card game Illimat with the Decemberists. We just recently made the Adventure Zone Bureau of Balance with the McElroy family. And yeah, like that. I also have about 15 years of experience designing video games, and I'm currently working with Airship Syndicate on their game Wayfinder, which will be coming out, I think, late this year.
Very cool. Oh, that sounds amazing. One that really sticks out to me too is the Adventure Zone. I am a huge fan of the Adventure Zone. It was actually one of my first actual plays that I listened to that got me back into D&D after a hiatus. So that's
Yeah,
exciting.
no, we're big fans. I will just say, having worked a lot with the McElroys on the game, they are just as adorable in person as they are on the show. So,
That's great to hear. Good. So I want to know, since you're a very prominent figure in the TTRPG space, gaming space in general, what originally inspired you to get into TTRPG writing and world building?
so when I was about 8 or 9, I obtained the original AD&D hardcover books. And I just thought these were fantastic. It was years before I actually tried to run a game, but I just loved them as books. Like, the monster manual is just like, here's this giant book full of monsters with pictures. It was just a wonderful sort of compendium. So I loved those books. When I was in about fourth or fifth grade, I probably was when I started actually DMing. And for me, it was very much just by the time I was 14, I was basically saying, someone has this job. Like, this book exists because someone wrote this book. I have no idea how you get that job, but that's what I'm going to do. And just sort of kept my head down and kept at it, and eventually figured it out.
Yeah, that seems like the best path in life is to put your head down and do the work, and you'll get there. That's
Hmm.
great. That's exciting. Okay, well, thank you for that. That's inspiring too.
You can do it. You just got to keep trying.
You're right.
So,
You're absolutely right about that. As the audience, at least like D&D audience, probably is aware that Eberron is filled with so many unique adventurous aspects. I mean, such as Warforged, the Pirates of Lazar Principalities, Changelings, Artificers, the Magic School, So, is it Arcanics or
halflings on
Arcanics?
dinosaurs.
Halflings on
I'd say
dinosaurs.
Arcanics.
Arcanics? Okay, great.
Hmm.
Arcanics. The Western Frontier, which I know you've been working on as well. I'm a part of your Patreon Discord, so I've been
Hmm. Hmm.
seeing the development there, which is very exciting. Yeah, Big City Noir and Sharn, airships, lightning rail. Yeah, all just everything awesome is in Eberron. So like
Hmm.
with all these different aspects that are all included on that planet, what inspired you to create Eberron?
So everyone started with basically three core principles. When I was working on it, I had actually, as I said, I worked in the video game industry, and I'd actually just come off of 3 years working on a pulp-themed MMORPG that didn't end up coming out. And so I'd spent 3 years watching Republic serials and The Mummy and Sky Captain and sort of pulp movies, and I had that vibe in my head. And I was like, well, what happens if you put that vibe into Dungeons and Dragons? I love film noir. So basically, you originally had that concept of let's play with pulp action and adventure and noir sort of intrigue, part of what I like of noir is that point of shades of gray, good and evil aren't so clear cut, which often, especially when I made it, was not the case with D&D, aside from things like Ravenloft. D&D often good and evil are very clear cut. And so I like both of those ideas, saying let's push the action and adventure, let's play with the whole sort of more shades of gray and ambiguity and difficult questions. And then combined that with the third principle being that, especially in third edition, magic in Dungeons and Dragons performed very scientifically. There was nothing really mysterious about it. A wizard could create a spell, they could teach that spell to another wizard. There was complicated, or not complicated, but detailed magic item creation rules. It was very much this is reliable, this is understood, it follows rules. And to me, that raised that question of if it's so reliable, if it's so, such a useful tool, why would it not evolve like any other science? Why would it just be limited to a few wizards in ivory towers? Why would you not have magical industry? And so Eberron was very much based on the core statement of Eberron was the Maltese, Lord of the Rings meets the Maltese Falcon and Raiders of the Lost Ark, and a world, then a world where magic is part of everyday life. And it really was that sort of idea of if in the Renaissance we had arcane magic as it exists in D&D, what does the world look like 300 years later?
Excellent. Yeah, and part of just a couple things that came to mind as you were explaining that is well, two things that really stick out to me always that makes Eberron my favorite D&D campaign setting is I love how the religions are less like deity based and more like
Mm-hmm.
ideology, like concept based. Like Blood of Vol is my favorite because it's about like
Me too.
believing in yourself. Oh, really? Yeah, I
Mhm.
love like yeah, believe in yourself, and it's less about like good, evil, and I also really love that it's very explicit how the each species it doesn't like any species can be any alignment. It doesn't matter
Mhm.
what you're born as. It matter what how you live your life. It matters. I just there's so much
And
freedom to explore there. Yeah, I love it.
And part of that, some of those things, like the religion aspect, for example, wasn't part of the original core idea. But as it became, as we developed the setting, the key aspects of it are first, it very much plays to the noir of, a world where you can just literally like Thor can walk up and you can have a conversation with him. It takes uncertainty out of the world. So that point of we don't have these iconic embodiments, sort of good and evil stomping around. Uh, it was something that supported the noir aspect, but also part of the point was at the time the other major setting was Forgotten Realms. And so as I developed Eberron, a number of points were just like, there's no real point in following in the same footsteps. Let's make a world that tells a different story. So a world, Forgotten Realms is very intertwined with active gods. And so the idea of saying, well, let's play in a world where you don't even know for certain that the gods exist, because that lets us tell stories about heresy, about schisms, about things like that that don't make sense in a world where you literally can just call God up on the phone and ask for an answer to a question. Likewise, one of the things about Eberron is a lack of powerful, benevolent NPCs. You don't have a Driz, you don't have an Elminster. And part of that is intentional because we want your player characters to feel like you are, pretty much the big heroes of the setting. Like if there's a problem, there's not a lot of people who are going to pop in and help it, save it. Um, and I will also say, back on religion, it is just that point to me that what I like about it is having the activist gods that you see in most traditional D&D, gods who are just going to pop up and punch people in the nose, means you don't experience faith the way that we actually do. And having more that point of with all the religions in Eberron, because we don't have gods popping down to answer the questions, developing all of them, you have that question of why would someone believe this? What does it offer? What is it, what are the questions and answers? So again, the Blood of Vol in particular, what I like about it is it starts from the basic premise of the question, what just God would allow death and suffering? And it basically says none. We don't believe they would. If the gods exist, they're cruel because otherwise the world wouldn't be like this. And then goes from that to say what we have is this life, what we have is each other. We need to stand together. We need to find strength within ourselves. And the whole point is, I'm like, I can imagine that as an organization. And so I like all of the religions of Eberron. Well, I like the Blood of All because it's just very different from the others. All of them, I can say I understand why someone would choose to follow this. So
Yeah, it's definitely when something is just factual, there's no test of faith. Yeah, you're right. It's just like, well, that's just they're right there.
it's
Like
like
that's
it's
a
like a
god.
sports team.
Yeah.
That's the point. Is in Forgotten Realms to me, and I'm not. This isn't a criticism. It's just in fact, it's in Forgotten Realms to me. Religion is more like a professional sports team. It's just like they exist, they're out there. Which one do you choose to back?
Who you rooting for?
Whereas
Yeah.
in Right, whereas in Eberron, because it is uncertain, there is even the question of why do you embrace religion at all? What is it that you're drawing from it?
Yeah, and we're all
I
tied better.
did love I loved early on in during when Eberron came out, someone was asking, well, with Dolar, the base afterlife of Eberron is you go to Dolar and you fade away. And someone was basically saying essentially, uh, part of it was like, well, if that's the case, see, now I'm trying to even remember. I think actually I'm getting my stories backwards. The story I'm thinking of was someone just basically saying, if the gods don't actually manifest in the world, why would anyone believe in them? And my thing is, do we live in the same world? Like, do you have gods, popping up, chatting with you all the day? Because, it was just very interesting to me.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, nothing against Forgotten Realms, but to me that
Oh
take
no,
on religion is way more relatable, which is
I
yeah.
I have to say I was just actually playing D&D last week with Ed Greenwood, who is absolutely delightful, and I love Forgotten Realms. But it is that whole point of it excels at telling a certain kind of story. It's high fantasy, high magic, gods walking around the earth, and the point is, no one needs to tell that story in two different places. So with Eberron, part of the point was specifically to say, let's tell stories you can't tell, stories about uncertainty, about difficult questions, and things like that.
Yeah. I love
About
it.
halflings on dinosaurs.
Yeah, and halflings and dinosaurs. Heck yeah. That's yeah, I love it. I love that where that came from. Perfect. So anyway, moving on. I could talk to you forever about that. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So I read online that the title of the setting was originally Thrilling Tales of Swords and Sorcery. Is that
Mhm.
true? And if so, how did the name Eberron get coined?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Originally, I submitted for the fantasy setting search. It was a one-page idea. And again, the core of the idea was, as I said, Lord of the Rings meets Raiders of the Lost Ark and the Maltese Falcon. It was really more, because it was only a one-page concept of the world, and it was really more almost about the flavor of it than anything else. So, as I said, the title was Thrilling Tales of Swords and Sorcery. And that stuck with it through the end. And essentially, I did, make a map and things like that as we went through. But basically, as I said, the name of the world, names are hard. And the name Eberron was actually, I believe, coined, as was the continent of Corvair. Both Corvair and Eberron were coined by Bill Slavicsek, who, of course, is one of the three, really at the end of the day, I call myself the creator of Eberron because I came up with the core idea. But again, a lot of the world, as everyone knows it, it was developed, that core team, Bill Slavicsek, James Wyatt, Chris Perkins, all of us, sort of sat in a room and hammered it out and made it cooler. And Bill in particular is responsible for a lot of the names. And the funny thing is you have a bunch of names where my original names were kept but moved around. So in particular, Brayland used to be Sharn. Like Sharn was the country.
Oh.
And so Sharn became the city. And there was the city of towers, but Sharn became the city, Brayland became the country, and Fairhaven is another one. On Dare in my first draft was called Fairhaven. And so there's this sort of funny which names stuck, which names dropped. But yeah, Eberron was Belslavisek.
If Sharn was the country name, what was the original name of the city, Sharn?
The original name was Shivern,
Shivern.
and Shivern, which is actually still on the map, I believe, as maybe a ruin, maybe a village in Valinor,
Okay.
which is
I
funny. As I say, that just got moved around.
I have my Eberron DMs
Hmm.
screen right here, and I was look. Yeah, I have like the map right here as reference.
Yeah, I don't know if that's that one has enough detail to see Shivern on it, but it is.
Oh,
And originally, it was called Shivern, and despite the fact that it always had the towers, like that was always the key feature of it. But I think my original name for it was actually the City of Knives.
the City of
So
Knives.
yeah,
Very cool.
going that pulp detail. And one of the other minor things I think I've said before is that in my original version of it, there was a much greater focus on the aquatic nations, which is something we end up seeing in my book Exploring Eberron. And one of the points of that is because the Sahuagin in the Thunder Sea were like a very important, powerful nation. That in Shivern, what used to, what would become Sharn, there was an entire district that was underwater, that was the Merfolk and Sahuagin district. And there was a middle area that had essentially a permanent area water spell on it called, it was Little Ysiria, but I think they called it Fintown. And the point is, anybody could go there because it had area water, and it was this is where you go to negotiate with Sahuagin scouts and things like that. So that's
Wow.
something that got dropped. I still like it, so
I love
feel
it. I
free to
love
add
hearing
that
that.
back in.
Yeah, I no, I mean, I'm very happy the way it is, but I'm happy to hear. Kind of reminds me of like hearing about the early beginnings of like Star Wars, like hearing that Luke's
Mhm.
last name was actually Starkiller instead of
Yeah,
Skywalker's. So I love
yep.
hearing the
Star Killer
developmental
Base.
phases. Starkiller Base, yeah, and it came
And
back
that's
in
and,
Force
and that's
Awakens.
exactly and that's exactly the point, is that that's the same thing, is a lot of the original names aren't there anymore, but they're somewhere,
Yeah, to come back another
so
way.
it's kind of funny.
That's awesome. Cool. Great. Well, okay. So, with the book Eberron Rising from the Last War, most of the setting, as we know, takes place not long after the last war. So, I'm really curious about the future.
Mhm.
The people of Eberron are known for its innovation with magic power technology. So, do you envision a much more high tech, maybe sci fi dominant era in Eberron's far future? And if not,
Oh, absolutely.
what do you? Oh, you do. Okay,
No,
great.
absolutely. I mean, to me, part of the point, as I said, part of the original inspiration for Eberron was this idea of, if you took the Renaissance and pushed it forward 300 years, what's it look like? And the next question is, well, what when you push it forward 400 years, and comparing that to our world 300 years after the Renaissance, 400 years after the Renaissance. And in particular, just in default 998 Eberron, part of the point is that the last war was spurring a lot of innovation, and just sort of in the default, what you get is the fact that Warforged are only 30 years old. Airships are only 10 years old in the default setting. And the idea is saying technology, magical arcane science is advancing, and go forward 50 years, things should be different. Even in Rising from the Last War compared to the original ECS, while we kept it in 998, part of what we've done is, because the system now has cantrips, is we've said, okay, well, that means there should be wand slingers. You now have people using wands essentially replacing bows and crossbows. And while I did a whole thing in Chronicles, which I'll talk about later, about crossbows aren't necessarily as obsolete as you think, but nonetheless, I do have to say one of my favorite quotes from um, Rising from the Last War is, I think, in the Ondarian description, where the person says, "Sovereigns above, Willis. It's almost the 11th century, and you're still shooting someone with a pointed stick." You
Yeah,
know,
it's kind of like the
but
okay boomer kind of a thing. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And so, definitely to me, if you pulled Eberron forward 100 years, it should be very different. We should start to see weapons of mass destruction. This is part of the point of, we don't know what caused the morning. It could have been the testing of essentially an Eberron nuke. That we should see all those things. We intentionally chose Compared to my original proposal, Eberron as it stands is actually more primitive. I did have essentially what amounted to wand slingers, to, equivalently phones and radios, and we kind of dialed it back for 998 just because part of the fear was that if you're too advanced, it doesn't feel as much like D&D. And so we made that choice that people are still going to be wearing armor. They are still going to be using swords and bows. But again, I think you go forward 100 years and it will look very different. And my side note on that is I just wrapped up, as you would know from Patreon, I just wrapped up a campaign called Cyberspace, which was my Eberron Spelljammer crossover.
Yeah, I was about to
And
say that. Yeah.
if I was doing that, basically, I just dropped it right into 998. But what I said with the principle of it was I want to run this as the space race. I want to not just say Spelljammers are everywhere. I want to say we're just developing them. Like this is, Undair and Brayland and Karnath competing to get to the moons. And I will say that if I hadn't been doing that quickly, if I had more time, if I would have been doing things, I probably would have pushed that forward a couple decades and, made other changes, to reflect the idea that we're saying we've now gone from air travel to now we're doing space travel. And, there would have been more arcane science being developed around that. As it is, I just literally dropped it in and said, they've done this, without making dramatic other changes to the setting.
Well, not to assume anything, but that to me kind of says that the sky's the limit going forward
Oh yeah.
with as players, as fans of Eberron, what could happen in the future, which
I
that's very exciting.
Yep. I will say that before Phoenix, before Eberron was opened for fifth edition, back about 7 years ago, I was originally working on another setting that was system agnostic. That part of the point of it was I was intentionally developing the world at three different time periods. The Mythic Age, when godlike beings walk the earth and magic is just in the world. The Renaissance, which is okay, the gods are gone and arcane science is becoming a thing, but it's still at an early stage. And then the modern age, where it was more of a cyberpunk, a magical cyberpunk world. And the point of that was the idea that you were seeing sort of the principles of magic as they evolve through these different eras. And I recently discovered, because I really hadn't read much of his work, that I think Brandon Sanderson has done exactly the same thing. And I'm like, of course he has.
Yeah.
But as I said, I love that idea of basically saying, okay, what does Everon look like? We know the principles. Are the dragon mark houses? What else have they come up with? How have things changed? What's the next evolution of wandslingers? So I love cyberpunk in general, and so I'd love to see. We often say the dragon mark houses are effectively megacorporations. Go forward 100 years, and you can just straight up say they are megacorporations.
Very
So there you go.
cyberpunk.
Yep.
I also play Cyberpunk, Cyberpunk Red, Mike Pondsmith's game, and yeah, it's totally cyberpunk for sure. And I'm
Yep.
glad that you mentioned Brandon Sanderson because I've recently been reading The Way of Kings, and I'm really
Mm-hmm.
loving it. Yeah, wow, that's super exciting. Excellent. I would also like to know, were you world building Eberron, or like proto Eberron before the competition that WotC held back in 2002? Oh, you weren't. Okay.
Not at all. So this is the thing, is that as I said, I've been designing a pulp MMO. So I've been thinking about pulp a lot. But no, in 2002, Wizards announced the fantasy setting search. I had literally actually just quit my job because I didn't like where the game was going. And so I had time on my hands and I submitted 7 ideas to the fantasy setting search. None of them were things that I was actually, had run before. These were all just, let's come up with some ideas. And Eberron was the last one I submitted, and I submitted it just because I thought it was fun. I didn't actually think they would go for it, but I'm like, I would play this. And so when they actually picked it up and came back to me and said, let's see, 10-page round this, I was like, whoa, now I have to actually figure out how this actually works. And there are pieces of it that draw on other things I've created. So the gnomes, in particular, Zilargo, is kind of lifted from one of my other campaigns, homebrew, but I'm just saying like it's just a piece that I pulled out because I love those gnomes. And similarly, I had another campaign where I played with that idea of essentially advanced magic being like science, where essentially what I did there was saying that the elves in this setting were basically cyberpunk elves, that they were just so far ahead of everybody else that they were essentially at a different tech level and were real assholes, frankly. But
It's pretty rad, other than being mean. Cyberpunk
yeah,
elves, be
exactly.
nicer to those gnomes.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Wow. What? Whoa. That must have been like a crazy feeling to feel that and like, oh wow, you like this, but I mean,
And
yeah, that you liked it in the first place probably meant a lot.
yeah, and not a lot of time. They came back the 10 page to the 100 page because basically first you submitted one page. They picked 11 of us. We had to put in 10 pages. They picked three of those. We had to give them 100 pages. And I feel like we had like 3 months to write a 100 page, story Bible, which is not that short a time in terms of just word count, but in terms of actually developing a compelling world,
Mhm.
like top to
Right.
bottom, it's a pretty intense, order. So yeah.
Interesting. Very cool. Um, so with that in mind, I'm curious, like, how did it feel like when they chose your setting as like this is like yes, we have it, you developed it. Now we're gonna publish it, Keith. Like
Oh, so
knowing
I
that
got
your setting is gonna be a D&D setting for 3.5. What did that feel like?
well, I gotta say, being picked out of the top three was not as intense as being picked as one of the top 11. Just because, again, there were like 12,000 submissions to the fantasy setting search. And again, I loved Eberron, but I thought it was just fun and wacky. Like, so when I actually got this call saying, hey, we'd like to see 10, I'm like, you're kidding me. Get out. And one of the things people have brought up, especially at the time, is I had published role playing works before. And so some people were like, he's already a published author. And I'm like, yeah, I was a published author for like Goodman Games. And I mean, that's a big difference from Wizards of the Coast,
Right.
like you're going to be the D&D, and so yeah, I mean that was amazing. And the crazy thing about it is, again, when it was the 1 to 10 page stage, I couldn't tell anybody. Like basically when they got down to the three, they told the world, and so everybody knew, I was working on it. So it wasn't like you didn't have this. The months before that was this intense, like I am working on the coolest thing in the world, and I can't tell anybody. And so that was a crazy, exciting time. But it still is. I just consider myself one of the luckiest people in the world, that it just is an amazing thing. Like I get people today coming up to me and saying, "Oh, I started playing D&D in high school and it was Eberron and I love it." And to me, I started out playing D&D in high school and it was Dragonlance. And so for me, sort of stopping and saying, wow, there is a generation of people who had that experience with my thing is just mind blowing. It's amazing.
That's very cool. And I'm going to put this out in the ether because I hope this happens someday with the upcoming Dungeons and Dragons movie. I hope it does so well that eventually an Eberron movie comes out. I
I
would
I
love
hope
that.
so. And I mean,
So
I
cool.
have to say I would love to see an Eberron cartoon series, except there is one and it's called Arcane.
That's right.
And the answer is no. I mean, there's things about Arcane that are not like Eberron, but
Right.
nonetheless, it's pretty good. If you like Eberron, you'll like Arcane.
Right. Right.
But yeah, as I say, I would love, I would love that. And I do think there's a lot of interesting aspects about the world. One of the things I do find funny is that I do feel a lot of things that were sort of new to Eberron, like that Eberron sort of brought in with D&D, have become increasingly more part of mainstream D&D. There is more of less of an emphasis on alignment. There is more of that idea that monsters aren't always evil, and but as I said, when Eberron was doing that back in the day, that was a pretty radical concept.
Yeah. It's almost funny because when I would play and run games myself, like because I got into D&D when I was a little kid with 3.5, and that was always kind of the way I saw it anyway. So when I saw that actually written in the player's handbook, I'm like, but I don't think orcs should all be bad. Like, so when I
Yeah,
saw Eberron, when I started reading that in 3.5, I'm like, yes, this is the way it's supposed to be, in my opinion.
and
Yeah, yeah.
that's part of the thing of one of the other design principles of Eberron was basically me just looking at this. We started with the concept of magic and said, if magic existed and followed these rules, how would it actually impact things? But then there's a lot of different things in Eberron where we're just like, if this thing actually existed, what would make sense? So part of that is if orcs existed, why are they evil? Like, what about them makes them evil? And similarly, you get things, the gnomes, the reason the gnomes are the way they are is because I was basically saying they are small, they're physically weaker than other creatures, they're quick, they have natural powers of illusion. Like this is all going to lend itself to a culture that tries to outthink its enemies instead of outfighting them. And, that creates this much more, the culture that we see in Zalargo. And going to the elves, and the elves, one of the things immediately said is if you live for 1,000 years, it's going to be kind of hard to let people go. And so the Pteranodon, the Arini, even the line of Vol, all of their sort of religion and culture is based around this. We don't want to let people go. And the Arini keep them around as deathless. The Pteranodon essentially become avatars of their ancestors, and Vol practiced, Mabara necromancy. But all of it is that idea of let's take this thing and say, if this actually existed, what feels logical to us?
That makes sense. Wow, it's so yeah, I love I love when things make sense because it feels so much more, yeah, so much more relatable.
Yeah.
It just
Mhm.
feels more connected. Fantastic. And I will modify my universal wish that actually I think I would prefer myself an Eberron TV series, like a Game of
I
Thrones
agree.
scale
Yeah,
tip TV series. That way you could just keep
absolutely.
going, like a
Because you
TV
get more
universe.
right, and I do feel that that's the case that Eberron is more interesting with the long term story. I'll say that with my novels, I wrote two series, The Dreaming Dark and Thorn of Brayland. And The Dreaming Dark is fine, but it is more of a classic, a party of adventurers travel over the world on a long, it's essentially more Lord of the Rings. And Thorn of Brayland is James Bond, it's a spy thriller. And first off, what I like about it is from that structure, you could totally do a Thorn of Brayland show because it is episodic, essentially. Each story is a mission. Each one is a new case. And also, what I like about it is it's more unique to Eberron. It's more saying if you had this world where magic is part of the world, where there is a Cold War, what does espionage look like? Whereas I love the Dreaming Dark books. I'm not saying they're bad, but it is a story that could be told aside from the specifics of the villain. The core story could be told anywhere. Whereas the Thorn books, it is a more uniquely Eberron sort of concept. And like I said, I could totally see Thorn in a as a show.
Excellent. I've been recently watching the anime Spy Family, and that's all about like espionage. I don't know if you've seen it or not, but
Mm-hmm.
that's yeah, it reminds me of that, and I could totally see an Everon story being very similar in an espionage genre. Very
Mm-hmm.
cool. So my copy of Chronicles of Eberron recently arrived from the DMs Guild. Very happy to have it, and I've just started to dive in. So what makes this book stand out next to your other great DMs Guild Eberron book, Exploring Eberron?
So exploring Eberron is goes much deeper into a smaller number of topics. And Exploring Eberron is the better book if you want the things that it covers. And the things that it covers are the plains, the Thunder Sea, the Decani, Droam. And, again, if those are the things you want, it goes really deep into them. And if those aren't the things you want, it's cool, but, you may not actually have as much to do with it. Chronicles goes less deep, but into a wider range of topics. And what I will also say is Chronicles has a bunch of pieces that are really just much more. This is general advice. This is for players or DMs. These are just things you may find useful. There is a section, things that jump out at me that fit this sort of model are a general knowledge, which is essentially saying we have all the books, we know everything. But what do people in the world actually know about the Lords of Dusk, the Draconic Prophecy, the Dalkir? And so, how does that actually fit? The article I mentioned before, which is saying just because we are using armor, we are wielding crossbows, don't get lost in the idea that they're medieval gear. Like, think about Eberron in the sense that everything is more advanced than you're used to. So, what does plate mail actually look like in Eberron? Because it's not from the 14th century. Um, there is a section I really like on session zero that is basically how do I start an Eberron campaign? And so, as I said, there's more things like that, that this is just general advice that will be useful, as well as some deep dives into things like, uh, Exploring Eberron has the general planes, Chronicles has the astral plane, which is one of those where Exploring says, what are the unique planes of Eberron like? Chronicle says, well, let's take the astral plane that everybody has. How is it cool in Eberron? Like, what makes Eberron's astral plane different? Um, so I think, as I said, the key is I think that Chronicles covers a lot of little things, and Exploring Eberron covers a few things in great depth. And so it sort of depends which of those you're looking for. But obviously, the right answer is get them both.
Yeah, get them both.
They're both
Yep.
cool.
Yep. And I have them both as well. Excellent. Perfect. With creating Eberron and your history of games such as Illicit, Phoenix on Command, and the Gloom card game, what are some of your favorite aspects about being a writer? Like, what makes it fulfilling for you?
Well, I'll say one of the things is I started off actually as a video game designer. And as I said, well, that wasn't the job I wanted. I knew I wanted to make D&D books, but that was the job I was able to get. And so that was what I started doing. And the thing about making video games is my first 8 years in the industry, I was a lead designer for 6 years, and none of the games I worked on ever came out. And it is that thing of when you're working on particularly MMOs, big games, you are going to work on them for a long time. You're going to be part of a large team. And it really is probably at best 50-50 as to whether what you do has come out. Whereas as a writer, I create something, I spend 6 months, I create a book, boom, it's out there and people are enjoying it. And so it is great to sort of have that focus outlet for creativity and imagination. It is great. I love hearing what people do with, just hearing people tell their own stories of Eberron and what they've done with it. As I said, that story of the person saying I started playing D&D in high school and it was Eberron is just amazing to me. That opportunity to give someone something they can build a story with. That's also been very much a general part of my design philosophy, which you see in Eberron, is I always want what I create to be a source of inspiration, not something that limits you from telling the stories you want to tell. And so because when I was starting out, I always did homebrew, but I would buy Expedition to Barrier Peaks. I would buy Against the Giants or whatever, and I'd find things that I liked and I'd use those, and then I'd make the other stuff. And so I always want to encourage that basically you may not have time to make a whole world, but well, start with Eberron and make some changes. What do you want it to be like? So as I say, to me, it's that combination of just a chance to give people something they can play with and to get to hear the stories of people who do play with it is just an amazing experience, as well as I get to work on something I love. So that's very lucky.
I love that. That's a great explanation. It's also, again, very inspiring. Um, there's after the first campaign with Journey Punks, they defeated Lord of Blades, and I'm actually writing the prep for the campaign. Well, this will be the next Eberron campaign after we do a Vampire the Masquerade Chronicle. But when we return, it's going to be almost 2,000 years in the future where the
Nice.
heroes of the first story are like a stable religion, kind of like in Dune,
Nice. Hmm.
where it's like, they've, yeah, it's basically, yeah, when Dune,
That's great.
spoilers with Leto 2 and Muad'Dib, and people
Yeah.
are like, I didn't want you to do this, but you're the Messiah. But I just defeated the bad guy. Don't kill other people's religion in my name, please. So it's like,
Hmm.
what do we do for that? So yeah, and yeah, it all started with
And
Eberron.
and I think Eberron is a really interesting place for that because part of what we've talked about is religion is driven by faith, and we've had a long running thing of saying technically, you could have a cleric who gets their divine magic from worshiping their boot, and we can all argue about where's that power actually coming from. But the point is, it's a perfect setting to say that yeah, we have some great heroes who 1,000 years later are even in principle, we have the idea that the dragons believe that dragons can become sovereigns, and that the sovereign isn't a stable position; it's a job, and eventually you move on, and a new guy takes over. But I'm just saying, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Excellent. So, what are some tips that you may have, or advice you may have for aspiring world builders and/or game writers?
So world builders, the biggest thing, I'll give you two tips. And tip number one is the first question of building a world is why are you building a world? And what I will say to that is basically, why are you building a world instead of using our world? What is it that needs an entirely new world instead of saying it's going to be Rome, but they've got magic or something like that? Because our world has so many details and everyone knows things and you can easily build off stuff. Now, the point isn't that I'm not saying don't make worlds, but I'm saying why are you making a world? What is it? What is the story you want to tell that is going to be better because you are making up a world to tell it? And this is part of why I encourage the elevator pitch. Lord of the Rings meets Maltese Falcon and Raiders of the Lost Ark is can you describe to me in 2 sentences what makes your world cool and like what makes it different? How is it not just Forgotten Realms or Eberron or Planescape? And so that's the first thing is understand why you are making a world. Why are you doing this and what are you trying to create? The second thing is I always think about go big or go small. And I prefer generally going small. Going big is where you start from the top, which is what we did with Eberron. Design the whole world, take a map and make the globe. How many continents are there? Come up with all the countries, come up with all the religions. But you don't have to do that. It's much easier to do things, and we've seen some of these just relatively recently with, say, Drakenheim, where you can start with just a place and say, this is Sharn, because let's face it, Sharn can support an entire campaign. And you can say, I'm focusing on Sharn. I have a general sense of what's around Sharn, but then I will expand out as I have time. I can start running the game in Sharn right now, tomorrow. And as we go, I'm going to say, by the way, you might not know this, but next to Sharn is, on Dare. Let's go there now. You don't have to have the entire world all at once. The other thing that I will say is if you're designing a world for publication, that is a different story. If you're designing a world for your friends to play at the table, get your friends involved. Find out what they want to play and ask them to add details. If you want to always, you want to play an elf barbarian, tell me about elf barbarians. What's their barbarian tradition? Because part of the point is if this is going to be something you all share, the more that players have some personal piece of it, some stake in it, the more compelling it will be to them. And again, if you're not selling it, they are your audience. Collaboration is what makes TTRPGs unique. And it's a chance to make an experience that you can't have with a novel or a movie, which is we all have made this together. So basically, that's my big thing is if you're making this at home, don't do it alone. The more that you sort of share things with your players, not only is it easier for you, it will make your players care about the world more. So
It's really great advice. Thank you. So, very different question this time. This is my last question for the interview. Uh, so, if you were to get a tattoo of a dragon mark, which one would it be and why?
well, I don't know. I mean, it is a very tough question.
What? You have one?
I'm not sure
That's awesome.
what I would do,
Oh, man.
but it would probably be the mark of make. And it's a tough call because scribing is also appropriate. So here's the thing: scribing and marking are both appropriate to me. And I do like the gnomes, but I think the argument for why do I pick making over scribing is because I'm not a gnome. So uh, and frankly, scribing, while obviously writing is an aspect of it, scribing is about communication, and that's not really the same. I'm not doing sending. I'm not, running. Whereas I am a creator, and so the market making is what I have. And I have to say, I was in a live play, as I mentioned, with at Greenwood last week, and I was playing Merrick's to Kenneth. And because this doesn't show very well if I'm wearing, clothes, I put the lesser mark on the back of my hand, and I kind of miss it. I like it was nice having it there. So, obviously I don't need two dragon marks. That would be weird. But I'm kind of like, oh, it's kind of nice having it there.
For those
So
who are
making all the
listening,
way.
yeah, that is amazing. Thank you for showing me that as well. For those who are listening on the podcast version of this, Keith revealed his shoulder dragon market making tattoo, and it
Yes,
is
the
super
greater market
rad.
making.
It is
Yeah.
awesome. I full disclosure, I did not know that, everybody. I did not know that. I wasn't trying to get Keith to flash that. It was just a question that I'd like to connect with him because I have actually been, I do not have a Dragon Mark tattoo, but I've been thinking about it and I've been thinking
What would you
about
get?
market detection. That's one at least my character that I've been playing with as a player in an Eberron campaign. My half elf has market detection. He is a paladin, a very broy, but heart of gold. What's the word? Himbo. He's a himbo. Very nice himbo with a market detection. Excellent. That's so cool. Awesome. Well, yeah, but man, what a great talk. Thank you, Keith. And
You're welcome.
before I forget, everyone go check out the Chronicles of Eberron as well as Keith's other works, including Exploring Eberron on the DM's Guild. You can go there and get your hard copy as well as PDF copies. And I believe, at least the time it's recording, there's usually a deal that's a little, you get a little discount if you get both at the same time. But yeah, go check out Chronicles of Eberron. Definitely worth it if you were a player and or a DM of Eberron campaigns, or if you just like really cool Arcana Punk storytelling. Yeah, and yeah, so we are wrapping up here. I just want to say thank you so much for being here and talk with me. I learned a lot. I really enjoyed hearing what you had to say and your wisdom and your experience. But yeah, is there anything you would like to plug, or do you have any closing
Sure.
words of wisdom to share?
I'll think about closing words of wisdom. On plug-wise is very easy. First off, my company is Together Studios. That's TWO Gather. So that is where you'll find Illimat, Phoenix Dawn Command, and Exploring Eberron, in fact, although it'll link you to the DM's Guild. So togetherstudios.com is where to look for me there. I am Hellcow Keith on most social media, so you can find me that way as well as Together Studios. And also, as we've called out, I'm on Patreon where I am running an ongoing Eberron campaign that you can have a chance to play in. So check that out. Other than that, the thing I will say is words of wisdom is uh, enjoy what you're doing. Always enjoy the stories that you are telling and experiencing. And what I love most about TTRPGs is collaboration, that working together, we build stories that none of us would create alone. And don't forget that, make sure to work with your players or with your DM uh, because you're going to be able to create something amazing that you would never create alone. So have fun.
Excellent. Well, everybody, let's take that and run with it. That's great words of wisdom. All right, thank you, Keith. Closing out, this is Dash Gierhart. Be sure to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel and give a nice review if you liked it on the iTunes/Apple Podcasts app. And yeah, you can follow me at Dash Gierhart. That's a Gierhart. It's a German spelling on Twitter and Instagram. And yeah, thank you again, Keith. And all right. We're going to leave everybody with that. And I hope everybody has a great day, great night whenever you're listening or watching this. And take care.